He'd said goodbye abruptly, only to find himself stranded at a Dallas airport. As he frantically tried to find a flight, his heart sank to find all the planes were fully booked. Minutes at the airport turned into hours and hours into days. On the third day, something changed. Little did he know he was on someone's radar, or that this person was about to change his life. 19-year-old Jimmy Gable had two great loves: vehicles and the U.S. Army. Joining the Bundeswehr as a car mechanic was therefore an obvious choice. He combined his two passions. Joining the Army would also make his late father proud. While he was graduating high school, his family noticed that he had a strange, new determination to follow the path he was meant to follow. He passed high school and entered immediately. Little did he know that the path he had chosen would leave him stranded in an airport with no hope of seeing his loved ones. Jimmy had never been afraid of hard work, even before he joined the Army. When his father was still alive, he worked alongside him every day as a royal monkey, and still managed to excel in his studies. Jimmy's father was a veteran himself, so he was always telling Jimmy stories about his life in the Army. The father and son formed a deep bond while working on his vintage camera. That's why Jimmy always knew exactly what he wanted to be when he grew up. Just a few years later, Jimmy was on the verge of fulfilling his dream. He filled out all the paperwork and was enlisted in the U.S. Army. The process went much quicker than expected, and before he knew it, he was training to be a car mechanic. Due to the years he worked under the hoods with his father, Jimmy had exceptional skills. His trainers were impressed, and it wasn't long before he finished his education. But there was still a long road full of difficulties ahead of us. Life in the Army was everything he had hoped for and more. While some days were tiring, Jimmy always awoke with a sense of duty, selflessness, and passion. He had no doubt that this was where he was meant to be. While serving his country was all he wanted, something nagged at his heart. He never expected to miss his friends and family so much. He had only been on 2 tours but wanted to take a few days off to go home and see his loved ones. But he had a bad feeling that it wasn't supposed to be. Jimmy devoted himself to his post. But before leaving for the final 6-month tour, he had applied for leave and hoped to take some time off after the tour. He had followed the correct procedure and completed all paperwork prior to his last assignment. When he checked the status of his application, he found that his superiors had signed him up for another tour. He was devastated. Jimmy loved everything about the Army and everything that went with it. He was serving his country, living his purpose, and he knew his father was watching him from everywhere and was proud of him. But it didn't take long for the nagging feeling he'd been cramming into the back of his mind to intensify. He missed his family terribly, and there were times when he had never felt so alone. His mental health was taking its toll. He knew he needed to see his loved ones, even if it was just for a day. Then the day before his return to work, he received the letter that changed everything. Jimmy was stationed at Eft. But when he received the letter that brought tears to his eyes, he hadn't seen his family since last Halloween and his homesickness was becoming unbearable. The letter approved his vacation and confirmed he could go home for Memorial Day weekend. Jimmy didn't waste a second. He packed his bags as fast as he could and took the opportunity to walk home with both hands. But although he had seen terrible things in the Army, he could never have foreseen the hardships that would follow. Because Jimmy's departure was so abrupt, he hadn't had time to organize himself, and landed at a Dallas airport. He frantically searched for a flight that would allow him to fly on standby, only to find that every plane was full and people were flying home for Memorial Day weekend. As the minutes turned to hours and the hours to days, Jimmy's ragged heart broke. He had already been there 3 full days and had almost resigned himself to spending his vacation in the airport's reception area. He didn't know someone had noticed him and was about to change his life. Every second, minute, and hour that Jimmy spent at the airport was agony. He couldn't face the thought that he could have spent that time with his family. Worse, he should be back in Eft. But through Wednesday of the following week, the way things were going, he had a horrible feeling that it would be a long time before he saw his loved ones again. As he sat with tears in his eyes, trying to figure out how to get home before his vacation was up, a middle-aged man in an expensive business suit approached him. The man asked Jimmy why he was sitting against the wall with his head in his palms. Jimmy explained everything to him and told him that every flight he had tried was booked. The man could see how desperate Jimmy was. After learning that the teenage soldier was back in Eft, but a few days after Memorial Day weekend, he decided to intervene. The man helped Jimmy to his feet and looped the soldier's bag over his impeccable suit. With Jimmy in tow, he walked to his plane and asked the front desk if Jimmy could be seated in his place. But of course, the companions denied the request on the grounds that it was against company policy. The man thanked the servants and backed away, smiling as he asked Jimmy not to give up hope. "Let me call someone," he said. The man went away for a few minutes to talk to him on the phone. Jimmy could see how tense he was as he explained himself. But then his body became less stiff and his warm smile took over his face again. He walked back to Jimmy while pocketing his cell phone. "The woman says hello," he grinned. "I explained our little situation. I want to buy you a seat, but I had to speak to her first." His smile never faltered as he continued to speak. What he said to Jimmy would bring both men to tears. "My father was an Army veteran," the man said with a wistful look on his face. He told Jimmy how his father died in combat rescuing his regiment from an ambush. Jimmy also spoke about his father, explaining that everything he did now was in his memory. The men shed tears as they shared their father's legendary stories. But although they enjoyed each other's company, they would have to say goodbye. The man said goodbye and boarded his plane. Jimmy would soon follow on another plane. He would see his family over the weekend as planned and return to base as instructed in his leave letter. As he sat with his family telling them of his adventures in the field and at EFT, Good he could only thank the Good Samaritan who had gone out of his way to bring him home. Disclaimer: in order to protect the privacy of those depicted, some names, locations, and identifiers have been changed and are the product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual events, locations, or persons living or dead is purely coincidental.